Hey gang, Scott here. In this video I want to talk about contrast in our landscape photos, and I don't mean how we apply contrast in post-processing with different sliders. There is of course an aspect to it, but more generally contrast, the types of contrast to be on the lookout for as you're working with your landscapes. That's from the capture all the way through the processing. And there's really three types of contrast that I'm paying attention to when I'm working with my landscapes: light versus shadow, color contrast, and then texture versus smooth. And I want to show you a few examples of this, and you'll see that some of these different types of contrast, more than one, appear in a particular landscape. So let's have a look. Let's start off with light versus shadow. Classic contrast, dark versus light. And I'll start with a black and white photo because it's very straightforward to see, light versus shadow, bright versus dark, what we may traditionally think of as classic contrast in a photo. We have everything from very bright spots to very dark spots, and the differences between the light and the shadow add to the photo, where if this were where it was originally when processed, it was much more middle grays going through there. The contrast of brightening up the fog around the trees, making the trees darker, making sure there's this portion of the valley, this tunnel view at Yosemite. I'm sure many of you recognize this. This part here is brighter, and there's that cut line where the sun is being still coming through into the valley, making sure that's a clean line to give that emphasis on there are bright parts, there are dark parts. It doesn't always have to be a black and white photo. Of course, we can have light versus shadow in color photos. And here in Death Valley, the light coming through, this is some side lighting here, and the fact that there are these deep shadows in the ridges, that adds to not only depth in the photo, it gives another level of lines. So these shadows contrasted with the light can give more emphasis to your photo. It can create lines. It can do a lot of things that are helpful, not just I'm bringing out some detail, or I'm kind of getting rid of the middle gray. One more example of light versus shadow, some sunbeams coming through trees here, where the combination of the two is what makes the photo much more compelling. That you have these bright beams coming through, all filtering through the trees, and the trees stay relatively silhouetted. So light versus shadow is the first type of contrast, and the most common type of contrast I think we're aware of, because we have sliders like contrast and clarity and texture, and we have filters like dynamic contrast and structure, all those things that emphasize small details by increasing separation of bright tones and dark tones. Second type of contrast I want to talk about is color contrast, and this one, again, it shows up in landscapes all the time. We can take advantage of that to make our landscapes more compelling. Let's have a look at a couple of photos here. Here's a classic sunrise photo, and of course, the wonderful golden light in the sky is great, but what's adding to the photo is we have good color contrast. We have cool blues versus warm yellows. You know your color wheel, or if you don't know your color wheel, go study your color wheel, get familiar with it. We're looking for those contrasting colors, things that are on opposite sides of the color wheel. They complement one another very well. Here is another example. This is red, green, and we actually have blue thrown in here. The lighthouse is great, but this is a midday kind of photo. But green versus blue versus red, all those colors complement one another. It is color contrast. We have very clear separation of these different elements here. The third one here, I want to show you this one that's a little more subtle. And so the color contrast that I emphasized in post-processing was actually out in these trees out here. Let me zoom in on those. And so the valley floor is relatively warm, right? That's a relatively warm tone, a yellowish tone. I selected all of the different trees out there, and decreased temperature, making them a little bit cooler. And so taking advantage of that color contrast so that these almost like a stream of trees that is following the river all show up, and they came out from the valley floor a little bit more. So taking into account color contrast to bring forward certain elements or separate certain elements that can add depth, add dimension to our landscapes. The third kind of contrast that I want to cover is smooth versus texture. We can emphasize this, or I should say take advantage of it when we find it in nature to make stronger landscape photos. So here is a relatively extreme example of smooth versus texture contrast. And this remnants of these pilings here, those are very crisp, very clear, and then the still water of the harbor, and even to a degree, the boat out here is a little bit softer just because of the fog. That's an example of texture versus smooth contrast to make particular subjects very prominent and other subjects kind of just smooth away from our eyes. Our brains will kind of process all of that smooth area as, okay, I've kind of seen that before. It's not gonna distract me. But then here's something sharp that's gonna jump forward. That's how our viewers will perceive that. A second example. This has got more texture through it, certainly in the rocks, some in the sky, but it's the wispy, whitewash whipping around the rocks here, that has a smooth texture to it, and then the emphasis on the details that are in the individual stones. That's another part of a smooth versus textured contrast we can tap into. One more example, and this is a very, very, not jarring, is not the right word, prominent texture versus smooth contrast. We have the architecture, the bridge, the stonework, all of those things are very crisp. And then it's diffused on the bottom with the reflections in the river, and the sky, in this case, happened to be empty. It kind of helps to emphasize and isolate the photo. This also has that combination of color contrast. We have warm versus cool, and of course there's light and shadow in here as well, right? The repeating curves of the reflected dark underparts of the bridge. Light versus shadow is going to be in almost all of our landscape photos, or cityscape photo in this particular example here. But that's way of using multiple types of contrast to bring a photo together. But to recap that, so you've got three kinds of contrast to keep your eyes open for. You have your light versus shadow, have your color contrast, and if you're not familiar with your color wheel, just remember, like warm versus cool. Think about holidays, Christmas, red and green. There's a reason these things go together. Sports teams, there's a reason certain sports teams have certain color palettes, like orange and teal is popular. Those types of color contrasts. And then finally, smooth versus textured. Anytime you have something flowing, soft, it could be the sky, it could be moving water, anything that's supposed to kind of just be uniform, and then contrast that with something that is strong, textured, that's sturdy and going to jump out in the photo. Hope you found the video useful. Any questions, drop them below. And until next time, my name's Scott Davenport. Have fun.